Hi there.
Hi, Steve, and welcome to you. If you're just joining us now, this is a very special Ivors Academy in the studio with the awesome Grammy Award-winning Steve Levine and myself, Chris Hawkins from Six Music. Hi there, Steve.
Good afternoon to you, Chris. How exciting doing this.
Yes, so I should say that we've known each other and worked together for many years, and this is the first time we've done anything like this in your studio, which is in Liverpool, right?
Yeah. And you have been here because this is where the famous Sean Keaveney Christmas record was recorded, and you came to do some sleigh bells and bits and pieces, I believe.
Yeah, it was an afternoon I'll never forget. Look, let's have a kind of nosy around your studio if possible, if that's all right.
Yes. Well, I've got my console in front of me, and I'm using an iMac, which actually I use normally for the, controlling of the mixing. So there's like little extra things that the monitor does. So that's why it's the right distance. Then I've also got my camera, which hopefully will turn on in a second. I've used my phone here. So hopefully you can see that. So that I've just put my phone on a stand. So there's the main my workspace, if you like. As I move it, you can see the studio through the glass, my modular synthesizers, my vintage stuff over there. And then if I go right around, not too fast, so it's not too dizzy for everybody. There's the rest of the studio, guitar pedals in the corner, vinyl, and there, and back to the beginning again. So there's a quick 360 of everything. I'll leave that there for the moment. There you go.
And how long have you had that studio in Liverpool?
It's nearly 7 years now.
Okay.
Time flies, doesn't it?
Previously, you were in London.
Yes, I had a studio, as you know. I used to live in Fulham, and my studio was at the back of the house. Okay. But I guess there were lots of reasons for moving, and as you know, I was busy doing a lot of radio stuff with Six Music and Radio 2 with Richard Allenson, and the facilities that we had in London were restrictive, especially as living in Fulham, I was under the flight path, and it was getting more and more noisy for voiceover work. And as you made the move up to Manchester, as you know, there was this big wave of things coming out of Salford, and so part of the radio production, some of it we did working with the people from Salford, which was fantastic. Hence the Great Culture Club with the BBC Phil, things like that, which wouldn't have happened had I been in London.
Now, we'll come on to some of the work that you've done through the years in a moment. But where you are in Liverpool, I think it is of interest and important, isn't it? Specifically, you're in the Baltic Triangle.
Yes. So Liverpool's Baltic Triangle is kind of like a creative hub. It's I guess modelled on things like Shoreditch and a little bit like Tileyard in London, for those that are familiar. So I've got a recording studio here. Near where my studio is a massive complex called Elevator, which has lots and lots of musicians who have their own recording facilities. I'm about 10 minutes from Parr Street. People may have heard of Parr Street. But there's also, more importantly in this area, there's lots of other tech items. So for example, there's Milky Tea, the games company, who I've done some music with. There's lots of other sort of website designers, that sort of thing, all tech-based, although nobody at the moment, because of course with the virus, it's very, very quiet here. Obviously, this is my own private studio, so I'm able to come in and out.
Yeah, so how are you spending your time now in lockdown?
Well, as I said, it's my own private studio, so there's no one else here, so I'm able to come in and do the stuff. And of course, you know, I've got many, many board meetings, which I still do with Zoom, so the studio's been actually really handy.
Doing what specifically in the studio?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm just in the last stages. I've worked on a game which is called Hyper Brawl, which is out on Apple at the moment, but the main PlayStation and all those are coming up later in the year. So I'm in the process of just finishing the mixing on that. So it's just me doing the final mixing. And I've just finished a band that you've very kindly played called Hush Tones. That was one of the last things we did before the lockdown, because the Hush Tones came to me for my Lipper masterclasses. They were recommended to me by Dave Monks from BBC Introducing. And the sessions went so well that we said, why don't we finish them off? We finished them off, and then the lockdown came. And so we thought, well, just let's put them out. So I did a mix and we put them out. I'm so happy with them, and they're such a lovely band to work with.
Yeah, they're a great new band. And Liverpool, I think, is flourishing at the moment. It's going
it really is
a great wave of new bands. The lockdown, broadly, you're cracking on to a point. How do you think it's affecting the music industry, and how do you think the industry will come out the other side?
Well, I think it is devastating, because you have to remember that so many projects have this kind of food chain of people, from sound engineers to tech personnel, and with a live band, there's the roadies, the live sound. So it is devastating. I mean, absolutely, most studios are now completely empty. I mean, even in my own particular case, I had 2 fairly substantial sessions that have now been cancelled and moved till later on in the year. That has, a financial impact on the running of a studio. I'm not unique in that situation. The world has so many recording studios that are essentially, unless they're privately owned like mine are, that the doors are closed. And of course, all of this takes electricity. I have to leave my stuff on all the time. So even if I'm not doing anything, the running costs are relatively high.
I wonder if you can help me, because it's a question I'm being asked a lot at the moment. I'm not really sure what the answer is, but you've mentioned that you put out the new music by the Hush Tones that you got done in time. But lots of bands are asking me if now is the time or not to put out new music. Obviously, streaming services and the radio carry on, so that the platforms are there for bands. But I get the sense that now is not the time to be putting out new music. I know that lots of labels have put releases on hold. Well, what do you think?
I think it depends on what area you are within the sort of range of bands. So if you're a new embryonic band, then you can use this time valuably to create new songs. I think the danger area for bands is that middle area where you've had some releases, but you're now supplementing your recording work with live work. That is probably the biggest area where there's the problem. And then moving further up the food chain for the major artists that have their releases scheduled, they will, they can readdress everything. But I think use the time wisely if you can. Like, one of the things I've been doing, for example, is preparing sound palettes for things. So these are not song ideas. These are just kind of mood boards, if you like. So if I've got a sound, I can work on it. I can do the kind of stuff that is actually very labor intensive on a normal session. Plus, I can start to, as I always advise everybody, read the manual of your equipment. And even, I do read my manuals, but I've had time to actually go even deeper into something, and actually found a few little tips and tricks myself with some of the synths that I hadn't actually had time to really explore. So if you're a producer or sound engineer, use this time valuably to kind of increase your learning curve. If you're a new band, try the best you can and do demos, but don't spend so long on the audio, because it is really difficult. If the band can't get together, using Zoom or Skype or Dropbox and sharing the files, just get the songs recorded, and then wait till lockdown is finished to then produce something of better quality. Because I think the danger is if there's too much out there that's of poor quality, then it's just going to be noise, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think further to that, I wonder what you think about bands doing their sort of, if you like, bedroom, living room performances. It's
very hard, because it's very hard to do it in sync, as it were. It's easy if you're a solo artist, but for a band to all play live simultaneously with the delays between the different, if someone's on a faster service, there's a physical delay, which makes it really difficult. So you can only pre-record stuff. And of course, not everyone is a sound engineer. And so there are these terrible instances where people are, singing into the wrong side of the microphone, or their own environment is not a friendly environment to do recording. I mean, I'm in the control room of my studio. It's got some soundproofing, but it's not designed for me to do this. I would be better doing it in the studio, which is designed to do that. However, it makes communication difficult when I'm on my own.
Yeah, it's popular for singers and bands to be doing these performances. I'm just not sure that they're doing themselves justice in terms of what audiences and fans are seeing.
But you can do basic things. I get asked this a lot. How do you prepare your room? So there's simple things you can do, like put up some duvets or some drapes to try and deaden the room so it's less reflective. You can also, if you're actually trying to record a vocal, try recording in the corner of the room and dampening all that down, so that you've got a much more isolated sound. Because the trouble is, most front rooms are really not good recording spaces.
No, I just wonder if it's a time to wait for pause on recordings and use isolation time to be creative.
I think that's true, yes.
In Manchester, as I do, some of the great Manchester music was created on dark, wet, rainy days.
Mm. And as you said, be creative, because certainly if you're a DJ style producer, this is a perfect opportunity to kind of trawl through your sample collection and see if you can find some nuggets, because, you know, finding a sample can take ages. You know, I've just actually been going through some of my old DATs because I've got the time to transfer some of the DATs that I've got that I did, you know, scarily 20 years ago. And I've already found a couple of song demos that I'd started and not finished. I thought, you know what, that's actually quite a good idea. I'll pursue that. And of course, now with modern technology and the computer, it's much easier to sort of fiddle with things.
One or two shouts. Frank Blades, Christopher Jones, hello Chad and Charlotte Walker, David McKay, all joining with questions in a little while. But I think, Steve, right now I'd like to go back to the beginning for you and how you got started. It was as a runner, right, at a studio?
Yes, I started as tape op, it was the sort of technical term, which was at CBS Studios in London in 1975. And in those days, tape machines needed a human being to play, record, wind back. And so that was the job of the tape op. And then you slowly progress to junior engineer, which means you help set up the microphones with the assistant and senior engineer, eventually moving to assistant engineer and then full engineer. Now, it coincided with a great time in music where punk was just starting. And so CBS Studios had Studio 3, which was all of the equipment that was left over from Studio 1 and 2. So when they refurbished Studio 1 and 2, the bits and pieces no one wanted went upstairs to Studio 3. And that coincided with the punk bands coming through the studio. Plus, they allowed the junior engineers to work on said sessions because that was decided probably the best way of us to learn our craft whilst the bands themselves weren't actually paying for the studio time, because CBS had a policy of gifting the time to normally 2 or 3 days to a band to see if they liked the band. And that's how I got to work with all those great bands, you know, like the Clash, the Jags, and all those bands, because they were doing the demos. So Simon Humphrey and I were junior engineers that became senior engineers. And then we would do the big sessions in Studio 2, which was effectively the big MCI with automated mixing. But upstairs was the sort of old Neve desk with all the older stuff. So, you know, I've got a picture, hang on. Because Simon and I did a record together. So here's a picture, whoops. Here's a picture of me and Simon in Studio 2 at the time of doing those things. There you go. That was the record we did. And then what happened was, if people that can remember the timeline, Giorgio Moroder had that huge hit with I Feel Love with Donna Summer, and Sharon had Human Nature. There was suddenly, and the French group Voyage, there was suddenly a load of producers making disco records. It was really the thing. So Simon and I said, why don't we make a disco record? So we started making a disco record. We managed to get a deal for it. That was the record that became the release. Dance People was that for the fans out there. We had minor success with it, but what was really important about it was that Capital Radio picked up on it and they liked the production work on it. Then we became producers. And what was interesting was we were still working with all of our various clients as sound engineers. So we were sort of sound engineers by day, producers by night. And in fact, the situation was through PRS and the Ivors, they used to have, and whenever Kathy organizes this for the songwriters out there that are watching, please go to them, because this is what happened to me. They had like a sort of speed dating evening where junior writers all just got together. And this was in the old offices in Berners Street. And I met a guy there, Stephen Randall, and he was a songwriter. And he said, oh, you know, could you help me with some of my demos? Because I'm trying to write demos. And this was the period when there was a lot of jobs for hire, as in lots of bands. This is slightly post-punk now, but just before the New Romantic period. And so I went to his flat. He lived in the King's Road. We did a few demos together. And one of the demos, he already had a deal with Rondon Music. I worked with him on a song. that song started to get some sort of talk and action. And so I then signed a deal with Rondo Music myself, because they wanted both halves of the song. We nearly had a huge hit with it. It was one of those nearly moments, but it never was a hit. The upshot was that I had an advance, and I used that money to invest in the brand new technology, which was the Linndrum, which is here, which I still have. So this Linndrum in 1981 cost just under £4,000, which is a lot of money, which is my entire advance. But the Linndrum it could do that. The first time ever, hopefully you can hear that.
Yeah, yeah.
Digital drums, suddenly my demos sounded amazing.
So that was where the digital drums first came from?
This is the first drum machine. So everything about this was new. The fact that you could have, these samples. There was only ever 500 of these made, and one of the other famous users was Prince. So, for example, if those that love Doves Cry, there's the clap sound. But every sound on this allows you to change the pitch. So if you go, and there's the sound of when Doves Cry, and many others. So the Linndrum enabled me to then produce really good quality demos almost anywhere, and this was revolutionary at the time. The ability to to program a drum part from a click. Look,
why were so few made?
They're so expensive. Look. The fact that you could have time correction, look, that's the thing. Look, that's the thing that made it sound so great. And it launched a whole era of dance music. It enabled me to work on lots of different projects. One of them was the Angelic Upstarts, who wanted to have a sort of hybrid between punk and Human League that had just sort of started coming out. They were managed by Tony Gordon. Tony Gordon then said to me, would you come and see a band called Culture Club? I think I might try and sign them as a manager. So I met with John Moss, and John's thing that he said to me, first of all, John, for those that know the history of Culture Club, John had a stint in Adam and the Ants, who has 2 drummers. And so John said, I don't want 2 drummers. Can you think of any way we can not have 2 drummers? And it was very popular at the time, the Burundi beat, like bow, wow, wow, So I said, John, I have a Linndrum. Why don't we program the backbeat on the Linndrum, and you can then play real drums on top of it? And that was the start of the Culture Club sound. Now, I didn't realize how great a drummer John was until I worked with other bands, because John, by luck, was a phenomenal drummer and was able to play along with that easy peasy. The first 2 records, as most people know, bombed, which was White Boy and I'm Afraid of Me. But the 3rd single, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, went through the roof. And suddenly, I'm a record producer.
What was the difference, do you think? What was so special?
Radio 2.
Do You Really Want to Hurt Me?
I mean, George has mentioned this many, many times. See, the London scene at that time, this is why I was so disappointed when White Boy wasn't a hit, because White Boy was done on the Linn, and it had the sound of those dance records of the early 80s, like Spandau Ballet and Human League. They were really tight beats. We made a 12-inch single. I went to clubs like Billy's and they were all in London, Fubert's around the West End. And you saw people dancing to these records. You thought, oh my God, this is going to be a hit. It's so great, but it didn't translate to radio. And then when Do You Really Want to Hurt Me came out, it was actually Radio 2 and David Hamilton that broke it. He made his record of the week. And that's when we realized that the worldwide appeal of George. It wasn't just being cool and trendy in the clubs. It was we had to have the wider appeal. And Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, being a kind of reggae song, almost reggae transcends time. If you listen to Do You Really today, it almost sounds like it could have been recorded yesterday. It doesn't date. Whereas Karma Chameleon is absolutely the time of that period.
How driven was George then?
Oh, we all were. Everyone was. We had a real vision. It's fair to say that John Moss was really important in making sure that the business side and everything moved forward. But we were all, it was a meeting of minds. We were all the same age. We all had absolutely the same love of the same records. And I was able to bring to the band my technical knowledge, because I hadn't been long out of school myself, but I had this knowledge that I'd learned at school. And so it was a combination of how do we make this band sound so great live, and how do we make them sound so great on record? And I think we achieved that.
For sure. So from making your own music,
Yeah.
and that big love of disco, and working in the studio in 75, what happened between then, you learning the ropes, and moving on to make a big hit record?
Well, luckily, because CBS was a company-owned studio, I got to work with so many incredible artists. Some of them who came over from America to work on their actual records, but also in those days, the BBC required everyone to re-record their tracks to mime on top of the pops. So I got to work with, quite a large number of artists who I probably wouldn't have normally worked with because of that, including doing quite a few sessions with ABBA, because ABBA had been, yes. And the proof is that if you look on YouTube, you can look for the ABBA greatest hits, and you can see my hand in the video. Because we filmed a video at the same time. Because things like Seaside Special, and you see all that stuff on the internet. There's like these weird BBC shows. All of the miming had to be re-recorded because of the Musicians Union. So we went through, so I re-recorded SOS, Fernanda, Mamma Mia. So I got to learn how they worked as producers. That was a thing that was incredible. I got to work with so many great producers. Sadly we can't, well, I will mention because I work with him, but I did quite a lot of Gary Glitter's stuff and Hello. But more importantly, I got to work with Mike Leander, the producer of those records, who again showed me some incredible things. I got to work with Mickey Most with Hot Chocolate and bands like that. You see different sides of producers. So very, I guess over a period of time, I wanted to see how those producers worked. And then I learned my craft. And I think the major change for me came with Bruce Johnson from the Beach Boys. So the picture that I showed you is of Studio 2. Studio 2 had the American console, the MCI, and a lot of American producers wanted to come over and use that. But it's fair to say that some of the older CBS engineers didn't really understand how that desk worked, whereas I did. So when Bruce came over to do the Sailor album, he made a fairly firm decision. He said, I want Steve to be the engineer on this record. I don't want to work with the house engineer. Steve knows the equipment really well. And Steve knows, I'm talking the third person, this is Bruce telling the manager. He said, Steve knows how a lot of synths work. I want him on the sessions. And it caused a real stink, actually, because I was quite young. And so we had to put paper on the window so no one could see in. But after the sessions finished, Bruce took me to, he said, you need to come to Los Angeles for a while, work with me on some other projects. Because Bruce, here's your pub trivia question and answer is, people say, which Beach Boy won a Grammy? And it's actually Bruce Johnson, because he won a Grammy for I Write the Songs. Brian Wilson had never won a Grammy up until that point. So Bruce was a very hot producer in America at the time. He'd worked with David Cassidy, quite a large number of acts. So I was working on some of his other projects for him in Los Angeles. So I got to see how Los Angeles studios worked. And I was really, it opened my eyes, because it is fair to say at the time, American studios really appreciated the role of the sound engineer in a way that perhaps England didn't.
Why?
They realized it was such a craft. And still to this day, you look at some of the great records that are being made, those same engineers are on them. They treat the craft of engineering with the respect it deserves. And on any given session in America, you do have an engineer and a producer. So I came back full of all these great ideas in the way of the world and set my task on being a record producer. And thankfully, my paths crossed with Culture Club, which changed all of our lives.
You've got more Culture Club there at your fingertips, haven't you?
Well, just for the purposes of this, as you know, when we do the Record Producers radio show, we expose some of the multi-tracks. And as I just mentioned the Lynn earlier, I've got the multi-track to Karma. So I'll just give you a few little snippets of this. So hopefully everyone can see that. So here's the multi-track. As I mentioned about the drums, here are the drums at the beginning. So if I solo those. goes, you'll hear. So that's the Linn, and there's the cabassa, and then the bass drum. The other thing that I mentioned how great John is. So one of the disadvantages with the Linn was the hi-hat. We didn't ever, well, it's really cool and retro now, but at the time we thought that doesn't really sound like a hi-hat. So John overdubbed his hi-hat, but the thing that I didn't appreciate was just how great John is. Here's John's drums and overdubbed hi-hat, look. So, that's what a great drummer is, because we didn't have Pro Tools in those days. I couldn't time correct that or edit it. That's him playing live. The famous guitar sound, let me give you a bit of that, hang on.
Steve, where was this?
Red Bus Studios. Red Bus Studios is just off the Edgware Road near Marble Arch. So the sound of the riff is hang on. So, and the other thing about it is Red Bus Studios had this live area which was all tiled and mirrored. So the guitar sound here is the sound of that room, which I think you can just about hear on this speaker. So then that becomes the riff, and it also has a synth with it, which is here. So that's the famous riff. What else have we got that's jolly? I suppose you want to hear a bit of George. Where's George? So if you can see the, because multi-track was as it was in those days, this was done on 48 track, but you'll see that George's vocal is on 2 tracks because he couldn't take the breath between the 2 lines. So.
There's a loving in your eyes all the way. If I listen to your lies, would you say I'm a man without conviction? I'm a man who doesn't know. Contradiction, you come and go, you come and go.
There's quite a lot of vocals on there.
Amazing. So tell me about where George recorded his vocals.
So on that song, it was all done in the studio. I've got a picture of him doing it actually for some reason. I can't remember why. I think I was conducting it for some reason. It was just that thing of doing it on the 2 tracks. That was overdubbed, but famously when we did Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, the vocal track is done live with the backing track, which is very, very rare, and very rare then, certainly rare now. So he overdubbed that, but you can, he didn't do that many takes. He was pretty good.
Isn't there a story where his voice was so powerful that you had to get him to leave the studio and record in a corridor? No,
it was recorded in the corridor of Do You Really Want to Hurt Me, because when he sang in the studio, I could hear him on all the other mics. So I put him in the corridor so that I could record him properly. Yes, I didn't want any bleed on the other microphones because I was going to do the vocal live. And because it's a reggae song, for those that, are into the technology side of it, most reggae songs have like a dub delay on the vocal. And if his vocal mic had all the drums on it, I wouldn't have been able to get the vocal sound as I wanted it. So George is singing in the corridor of Red Bus Studios for Do You Really Want to Hurt Me. For this song, it's all done in the studio, done properly. And Helen's stereo track there, that's the result of, we used to record her 6 times on each part. So, about 20 or 30 vocals just to get that sound. It was a lot of work, but she had the patience and I had the patience.
Is that Helen who's Holly Cook's mum?
No. Holly Cook's mum so she is in the video of Do You Really Want to Hurt Me as one of the backing singers, and I think in Time as well. No, she's in the video of Time, that's right. And I'm in the video of Time as well for a few seconds. And Holly's mum also sang on some of the later stuff on the 3rd album. So on the 2nd album, it's 99% Helen, a tiny few bits of others, but mainly Helen, because Helen was able to do such a wide range of harmony parts. And we used to do all the studio tricks, we'd speed it up and slow it down. So if we needed the low octave, Helen had a low voice anyway, but if we needed a low manly sounding voice, she could do it. And then very occasionally, Phil Pickett from Sailor, who was playing keyboards on the track, he could do a few low ones as well. And I think even on some of them, I seem to remember, definitely not on this, but on some of the album tracks, I seem to remember me and Roy doing some, because we'd very speed it right down. So it's really just, you know, it's a sound. It's not that we're any great singers or anything like that.
That's still great to be able to say that you were on potentially, maybe on one or two.
Yeah. Actually, you can hear me and Roy. The on White Boy Dance is the one you can really hear. The callback is only me and Roy, and you can actually hear because it sounds like our talking voices, so you can hear that clearly on that track. Okay. Anyway, I digress, Chris.
Hello,
is that enough for everybody to hear that? As everyone, questions are flying through. But
I'd like to come back to a couple more shouts, and I'll get to the questions that have come in a little bit. Mark Fordyce, hello to Austin Noble, and anyone else that's
lovely Mark. So Mark was in the group called the Mood, and now collects lovely vintage synthesizers. So at the time of Culture Club, I then got a load of other projects to do. David Grant's, the Mood, a whole load of things. In fact, I think I saw a David Grant question there. We'll come to questions in a minute. But so yes, because the thing was, very quickly after doing that, having got my own kind of setup of the Linndrum, I had some synthesizers, and I kind of knew what I was doing with them because I read the manual. And I went to a school where technology was at the forefront. So I already left school with quite a lot of that knowledge. I mean, education is so incredibly important. So I was equipped with the right skills. And so the bands came to me then, as they still do now, as their sort of guiding light. Like, you know, here, Steve, I've got this thing. I need this kind of sound. How can I create that particular sound? That's, I guess, my skill.
Culture Club obviously changed your life. What did it lead to, Steve?
Sorry, what?
What did it lead to for you?
Well, it led to getting more access to more projects, I think, is the most important thing, because in those days, the producer's role was, I mentioned earlier about how the engineer was appreciated in America, but I think it's fair to say British record producers were treated with an enormous amount of respect and admiration in that 80s period. You think of myself and Trevor Horn and Swain and Jolly and all the producers of all these big records. We were, you know, there was the second British invasion. Most of what was on MTV in that period of time were British made records. Studios in England had really upped their game. And so the quality of what was being produced in the UK was, at the time, better than what was being produced in America. I think America, probably towards the 90s, when it became this sort of the Nirvana type sound, the rock band, found their mojo again. But I think through the 80s, I think British studios pretty much ruled the pop world. I think in terms of R&B and soul, America probably still had the edge. You know, some of those, if you think of the great soul music that was being produced in the 80s, that was fantastic. In fact, I remember when I was recording the Beach Boys, Luther Vandross was in the studio next door making what would become his most famous album. And so the way that the studios were geared up in Los Angeles for soul music was pretty good. You know, they really had the sound nailed. But I think in terms of pop, Britain had the edge, definitely.
Do feel free to keep dropping names like that. It's amazing.
Well, hey, look, Luther Vandross, you know, God rest his soul, was such a great guy. And this was also, you know, for those that work in studios a lot know that there's always the downtime in the reception area. And Westlake Audio had installed one of the first Space Invaders machines, and Luther was absolutely Space Invaders nuts. So we would play Space Invaders with him all the time. Sadly, I don't have a picture of me with Luther. I've got a picture of George with Luther, because Boy George came into the studio. Now, of course, everyone knows that we all love David Bowie. And for those that may or may not know, a very young Luther Vandross, I think he was 17, sang the backing vocals on Young Americans. Yes. So that was our kind of, because at the time of Luther being in the studio, he wasn't famous. You know, the record hadn't become, but we were fans of Luther because of that, you know.
In the 90s, you did the Honeys.
Yes.
And that went huge, didn't it?
I loved working with them, and we're still friends to this day. That was, for me, that was like a kind of second wind. It was really interesting because that came about because I'd worked back to Redbus, I knew Oliver Smallman, their kind of record label guy, and they came to me post working with Louise. So I'd worked with Louise on a couple of tracks on her debut album, and they liked the fact that I was recording at home. That was a big deal then. And so I met with the Honeys, who I know definitely in the first 10 minutes of meeting me, and this is unusual, you can normally tell in the first few minutes if you've got a gig or not. I often quote the story of Westworld, who didn't want to work with me until I met them. And within 5 minutes of meeting them, I knew I'd be making their record, and we're lifelong friends. And they even came to the hospital when my wife gave birth to our daughter, because we became that close. It was a lovely record, but with the Honeys, they really didn't like me straight away, because the problem was this was the period where lots and lots of writers were working with lots of artists for like a day. And so they kind of didn't know where they were going. They had like half of a song here and a half a song there and a bit of an idea. And to me, being such a soul fan, I just thought there's time now for another kind of 3 degrees. And that's kind of how I pitched it, that it would be pop music with a sort of slight R&B edge, as opposed to, we mentioned earlier about American R&B, the bands at the time, En Vogue and Brownstone, they were so slick. There's no way the Honeys could have emulated that, but we could kind of make that the benchmark, if you like, and try and get to that point. And we were very fortunate because Selena wrote Finally Found. She didn't, at the time, didn't have the second part of the verse. She only had the first bit. And because Heavenly in the band had such a great voice, we said, well, why don't we record another verse so that she can sing it, so it's like a duet. And that's how the whole thing with Finally Found happened. And that turned out to be a massive hit. And so they had a successful career as a result, which was, you know, really enjoyable for me to have a totally different thing. That then led to a whole plethora of kind of boy band records, which, you know, I can say now because, I mean, you know my daughters. At the time, they were young teenagers. So for them to come home from school and have 911 at the house making a record with me, I was the coolest dad in the school. Of course, now my eldest daughter, being a big cheese in the music industry, can laugh at it and think it's brilliant. But at the time, it was fabulous. I was definitely cool dad for a window.
I think you're still pretty cool dad. Because you're still making music with some great acts. And Charlotte's just asked, are you looking to work with any new bands, Steve? If so, what's the best way of sending you music? We'd love the Linndrum on some of our tracks.
Well, funnily enough, I've just recorded the Linndrum on a local Liverpool artist. Look, the best thing to do is, send me stuff. I do listen to stuff. It is fair to say that I can tell within a few seconds, even if it's a really, really low-level demo, if there's something there. Some people spend so long sending me demos where they've spent months on them, and it's just not a very good song or a very good idea. I can hear something even if it's on their phone. Dave Monks, who you know, has been a great conduit for me here, because a lot of bands upload stuff to the BBC uploader for BBC Introducing, and actually the quality is quite frankly not acceptable. And so Dave will say, this is what happened with the Hush Tones. He said, look, I've seen the band, they're really, really great. They could really do with your help. So I only want to work with something if I can bring something to the party. There's no point in me copying what someone else has done. So in Charlotte's answer, then get an MP3 to me. My website's there. You can click on the thing, you can send it to me. I'm going to update my website soon, by the way, because I haven't done it for a while. But I'm on Twitter and all those things. So send it to me. I'll listen to it, just an MP3. If I like it, I'll get back to you. But I can't promise anything because I do get snowed under. And, as you know, Chris, there is a lot of noise out there. Not a lot of it is good, but the good stuff does rise to the top, if that's any reassurance.
I agree with that. And it's something of a mantra of mine. And when I'm in your chair this time next week, I know that this is something that I'll talk about. But what I would say is, for anyone that wants to send you music, please, there is a lot of noise out there.
Yeah.
And don't send your 25 favorite songs that you've written over the last 20 years. Send the very best that you found, the song that best represents you.
Or 30 seconds of 3 songs, 30 seconds of a chorus. Or if you've got a great idea for a song, send me a private SoundCloud link. It's easy to do, and I can listen to it. And if I like it, I'll get back to you. And that has happened with some of them. In fact, the guy that I was mentioning, the Linndrum, I won't mention his name because I haven't finished the record yet, but he was we do a competition in Liverpool for sort of budding songwriters, and he was one where all my fellow judges didn't like it, but I heard something in it, and so even though he didn't win the competition, I said, look, you were kind of 11th in the running of it, but I would like to work with you because I think they're missing, I felt they were missing something. So anyway, look, there's so much great music out there. If I can bring something to the party, then brilliant. As I mentioned, the Hush Tones project was really, really enjoyable. They were a fabulous band to work with, a nice 5-piece from Liverpool. They've got female and male vocals, which for me as a producer is just so great to be able to play with all the different tones. And we experimented in the studio with different harmonies. It was really enjoyable. And I think, considering that single was done in a matter of days, it literally was. I can't think of the hours we spent on it, but not that many compared to some records. It sounds pretty damn good.
Joe's got to go, but she wants to say before she does that she's loved hearing all about your early work, Steve.
Thank you, Joe.
Kev says you'll love this question, Steve, because it's proper geeky. He says, if you only have the money to purchase one plugin, either synth or production, what would it be?
Well, if it's one plugin, that's kind of limiting. If it was one sequencer and there was no money, GarageBand is still very good to get your ideas across. I use Logic now, and I've also got Ableton and Pro Tools, and it just depends on the project. I have to switch between them depending on the client, but generally I use Logic. So I think, GarageBand is good. If you're more into loops and things like that, I think it's fair to say that Ableton is probably the way to go. So if it's that, in terms of synth plugins, if it was one plugin, then I think those, for example, the Roland Cloud is really good. That's one plugin, but it gives you access to everything. So that you'd be singing for days. The Ataria suite of software plugins is fantastic if you want retro synths at a fraction of the price. So that's kind of not the exact answer, because I don't think you can have just one, because otherwise you'd only have a keyboard, wouldn't you?
Kev also wants to know, what was the most satisfying session you worked on and the worst?
Okay, the most satisfying, I've had lots of great ones, but going back to the Beach Boys, I got to work with Stevie Wonder on it. That was one of the most satisfying things to me, because Stevie is a hero of mine. Yeah. And to work with him, and he was unbelievably professional, and I was so nervous. So here's what was happening. I'll do one quick story. So bearing in mind Stevie can't see, he's programming the Linndrum. He programmed this Linndrum, right? Now so he programmed a beat, and they'd say, Steve, because if I go back to the screen so you can see what. Right. So the way the Lin works is you program. This is interesting just to highlight the story. So you program your beat. So say you do pattern 4. So you do the click, and then you do it. So Stevie would say, okay, give me another blank pattern. You play the part in, and then there's a feature called copy here, where you copy one to the other. So when you say copy 01 to 01, you get that noise, the bleep noise. Mm-hmm. You hear the bleep. Yeah, but you also get the bleep noise when you do this. Like that, when you accidentally erase it, and you can see the two keys are right next to each other. And I was so nervous. Can you copy bar 5 twice and again? And he went, beep. And he went, would you like me to play that again? Because he knew that I'd erased it from the sound of the bleep, which is just so funny. So that was so enjoyable. And working with your heroes. Some people say, don't be disappointed. That was the best session. The worst session, I don't have that many. I can't say I can't say the name. There was one session from somebody that won. I've never done it since. Somebody won one of those talent shows in the early days. Yeah. And I was asked as a favor by a very well-known manager, and I did it because of him, to work with this particular artist who was so useless that it was just horrible. It was so horrid and unenjoyable, and he was an arse. He thought he was Rod Stewart, and he just, anyway. So that's the one and only time I've done. I won't say it.
Ah.
But I've done some weird sessions. You know, they've all been strange in some ways, but generally speaking, enjoyable.
Okay, good. Steve, here's another proper geeky one. Talking modular synths.
Yeah.
Do you choose a method of playing and exploring the modules and grabbing samples for further processing? Do you create your own sample packs using SysX for
okay, so SysX is the MIDI
storage in projects is still useful. Are you still doing this?
Right, okay, so yes, I do create sounds freshly with my modular. One thing I do definitely do, and I did it only the other day, back to the earlier point of the conversation, I've got a Driftbox, this thing here. Can you see the little synth there? So I was working on a track. I'm working with my friend Stephen Langstaff on a track, and I got this sound that was really, really great. So I recorded it as audio in the program because I knew that the moment I turn that on the next day, it's not going to sound the same. Modular synthesizers have the brilliant thing of being terribly creative. You touch one thing and it doesn't sound the same. So in answer to that question, the very next thing I did was to make a sample set of that sound because I was so happy with the sound. I wanted that for later use. So yes, I do. And the other advantage of doing sample sets is that most of the modular synths are mono, and so you can't play a chord. Whereas if you multi-sample it, you can then play a chord, especially with some of the stranger sounds where you get like a journey on the sound. They sound great, particularly for film music, if you play chords. So yes to that. With regard to SysX, which is the way that you can load a whole bank of sounds into a thing, yes, and I did it yesterday because Korg have just released some new sound sets for their plugins. So yes, yes, yes to all of those things. And try and back up your SysX if you can. So a SysX is a dump of the entire, you know, the catalog of the whole synth, and it's a very small file, but once you've got it, you can restore those synths that have it back to it. And I do sound sets. I've got a couple of sound libraries. In fact, the Lin and a few of my other vintage drum machines are on Native Instruments sounds.com. So if you go to sounds.com, not the BBC one, sounds.com, it's like a, you pay a monthly fee and you can have anything from the native library, but I've got some 80s, all these drum machines, I did some sample sets of them, which were recorded both digitally and analog, depending on the flavor that was required. So hopefully that answers that chap's question. Yes,
that was Austin. Adriano says, what monitor speakers do you recommend with a price range under £1,000?
The Neumanns that I've got, which are there, which I think are just £1,000. If you can see those, they're pretty good. And those are with amplifiers and they work really, really well. And the reason I got those was when we were doing the radio series, I was on the Pink Floyd edition and we were spending a long time. Pink Floyd very generously gave me their multi-tracks for the show, but I had to try and recreate what Alan Parsons did for the show. And I was spending a long time on it and I was getting quite a lot of ear fatigue. And then Sennheiser recommended trying those, and I tried them, and both Richard and I and Neil Miners, our producer, went, "Oh my God, they're the ones," because you could work on them for a long time at a lower level and hear the detail. So I've had them ever since, and I love them. They're great for mixing, but over here I've got the JBLs, and then of course my original Oratones and the Avatones. Always good to mix and match speakers.
I love seeing in the studio there because I haven't been for a long time, but as you said right at the start, I have been on several occasions, but not for a while. And you just have the most amazing sound in that booth. I remember recording some voiceovers with you, and it is the most perfect dead sound.
Well, it's because over the years you just get to learn stuff, Chris. That's the answer. It's experience. I'm a better producer now than I was then because I've just learned more stuff every day. You learn something.
Experience counts for everything, doesn't it? Here's Mark saying, what's your favourite go-to synth and drum machine sounds?
Depends on the genre, but I did used to have an 808 and a 909, and I've recently got the new shiny Roland over there, which has both the 808 and the 909. You can pretty much do a song with that, really, really easy. So if you're only going to buy one, that. But at the other end of the price point is the Volca range over there. Hopefully you can see that. There we go. I think those are fantastic value for money. They're only £100 or thereabouts. So and there's a lot of them secondhand as well. So that's, you know, if you're doing that for a basic thing, obviously the Linn's at the other end of the spectrum, but those are very easy. But if you're working in a DAW, a digital audio workstation, then there's so many great sample packs available for all these samplers. So, you know, you can pretty much sample anything.
I'm nervous that anyone watching now might be intimidated by the amount of gear you've got. For those that want to have a go at producing themselves, it's not essential to have everything that you've got.
No, but Chris, I've been doing this for 30 years, so I didn't buy this yesterday. This is, I mean, some of the stuff in my rack I've had for 30 years. Well, the Linn, for example, 1981. So, you know, how many years that is. So I've added to my equipment list as time has gone. I've sold things over the years. I've regretted selling things. I used to have a 2600. I used to have a Mini Moog. I sold my Mini Moog, which I don't regret selling because I bought an SE1 synth to replace it. I sort of now regret selling my 2600, but they've just produced a new one. I never had an ARP Odyssey in the 80s because I could never afford one. So I bought one now when they were reissued, and that is a fantastic synth. I love it. So in terms of basics, you can do it with a laptop, absolutely, and GarageBand. And you don't need anything else but a great idea. Because as everyone says, all the gear and no idea.
Have you ever lent that Linndrum to anyone?
Yes, but only Stephen Randall. I've only lent it to him once. I was going on holiday and I lent it to him for a few weeks, and he wrote a load of songs with it. But that's the only time. I wouldn't lend it to anyone now. It's too delicate. The only thing I have done with it though is there's a guy in England called Kenton Electronics that makes MIDI interfaces. So I did lend it to him so that he could develop the MIDI interface for the other Americans that wanted one. Because he phoned me and said, Steve, I've got loads of inquiries from a load of hip hop producers who have bought them in America, and they want MIDI on them. I don't have one to work out how to do it. Can I borrow yours? And then he did fit mine with it. So mine's actually got a MIDI interface on it. The other thing that I did have in mine, which I didn't explain, is in the back of mine, Dave Simmons of Simmons Drums. If everyone remembers the early Culture Club, John had a Simmons kit, the one that had the reggae colours on it. And we used to go up to Dave Simmons' factory, he was a small company then, and he fitted some sockets on the back of my Linn so I could play the Simmons from that, which was great. So
that Stevie Wonder has actually...
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That Linndrum.
Yeah.
This one from Caroline, do you tend to mix as you go along, or do you mix at the end of a track?
Depends on the project, but so with the film music and the game, mix as I was going along, because I'd often have to give the client a sort of work in progress. So absolutely. With a band, so for example, I've just finished the Vapors album, which is coming out in a few weeks' time. That was a traditional old school record where the band played live in the studio, pretty much everything live. Although we recorded it into the computer, it was almost like a tape machine. We did hardly any manipulation. And so my mixing console was like a normal mixing console. So that, you know, on this desk here, it's got moving faders. So, you know, I can, you know, like so on and so forth. If you can see that, yeah. Can you see that? So it's just like an old school. So we literally had everything on faders and mixed as you would a band project. So it does depend on the project. The only thing that was a great compromise for technology with the Vapors was I was able to, for the first time, record the guitars with multiple mics, which normally you wouldn't be able to do on tape because you'd run out of tracks. So I could have a close mic and a room mic, and I would then mix those as a stereo within the computer, but it would come up on a fader on the desk to answer. So that's a hybrid between mixing in the computer and mixing live.
And Akido says, are you a fan of the Alchemy sounds in Logic Pro, Steve?
Absolutely. And again, the earlier person was mentioning about sound sets. Put your own sounds in it. It's absolutely incredible if you put your own sounds in it.
And
it's just drag and drop.
Steve, if you could only keep one piece of equipment, which would it be and why?
Well, it depends. If I was giving up recording, I'd keep the Linn just for old time's sake. But I guess if you kept a microphone, I've got some good microphones. A microphone will always, you know, there's always someone that needs to record something, depending what I was doing, you know. I'm not retiring.
If you could record with anyone, who would it be? What contemporary artist?
contemporary artists. Who do I like at the moment? Well, I'd love to do something with our mutual friend in the studio, Tim Burgess, because I've never recorded him in the actual studio. But do a side project, not a, you know, like a. I like doing projects where people come in and it's a new thing, you know. So because we're both big fans of Tim, and that would be something that's interesting. I think that who's really good at the moment that I really, really love. I like that Blood Orange. The production on those tracks is excellent.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is so much great music being made at the moment, which is really, I think, very encouraging. And what's really interesting is how the production on some of these records is really breaking the boundaries, where people are coming into it, sometimes perhaps through naivety and sometimes perhaps with experience, but there's some sounds being made that couldn't have been made 5 years ago.
Steve, before finishing, can we just get a bit more of that George multi-track?
Okay, what bit would you like to hear? Is this for you or for a question?
No, that's just, it's for me and for everyone, just
okay.
A little bit of isolated George.
Okay, hang on. Let's do the middle 8 bit.
Come a chameleon. You come and go, you come and go. Loving will be easy because we like my dreams. Like my dreams.
Oh, I'll tell you one thing that's so that's just reminded me. So one of the things with the Lynn, right, why this is quite important on this track is that I didn't this is about experience. So this song really should have been recorded in 2/4, not 4/4. So we were running the Lynn really fast. So when I had the pattern, I haven't got the pattern here, but it was running at a very high tempo, which meant that the Lynn had slightly slipped out of sync towards the end, and I didn't notice it because everything was played live. But when we came to put these backing vocals in, they were recorded on only the first chorus and then copied down. That's why you get the, because I had to, you can't see on it, but I had to manually move the tape just like a tiny bit to make them fit.
Steve, we're right out of time.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's been an incredible hour. Your stories are amazing.
We haven't got to half the question. I apologise to everybody.
I know.
Send them to Kathy at the Ivors and maybe we can do them offline or something. But thank you so much, everybody.
That insight that you've shared is absolutely invaluable. Thank you so much, Steve Levine. I'm Chris Hawkins from Six Music, and I'll be where Steve is next week in his chair in conversation with the wonderful Hannah Peel. For now, on behalf of the Ivors Academy, thanks so much for joining us.